Hey friends, and welcome back to my series on studying effectively for GCSEs and A-levels. Before jumping into some studying techniques that work effectively, we will be discussing some less effective studying techniques. Much of this information will be based on the research paper titled Improving Students' Learning with Effective Learning Techniques, Promising Directions from Cognitive and Educational Psychology. And this is a review paper, meaning what the authors have done is that they've gone out and read hundreds of other papers of various studies and experiments done in the field of educational psychology and put together the key findings and compile them into this paper. So the authors go through 10 commonly used learning techniques and rate them across the various criteria, then group these learning techniques into low, medium and high utility. Now in this series we will be focusing on the medium and high utility activities, but in this video I will be mentioning the commonly used low utility activities, and we'll refer to these as passive learning techniques, which means they don't require much mental effort to use. And whilst passive learning techniques may sound great, after all, who doesn't want their revision to be as effort-free as possible, we will learn that during this series, the harder our brain has to work to retrieve something from memory, the better we learn it and the longer it will stick. Do bear in mind that I'm not saying that people haven't achieved good results using these ineffective learning techniques. There are many people who have, but what I'm saying is that there are better learning techniques you can use to achieve the same results, if not better, in about a fifth the amount of time. As always, timestamps will be in the description down below, so let's get straight to the video. Now, by far the most commonly used revision technique is rereading, whether it be our class notes or revision guide. This technique is something that many of us naturally default to when growing up because we aren't really told what else to do. The idea that people tend to have is that if you reread something enough times, then it will eventually become burnt into your memory, but this isn't entirely true. Now, I'm not saying that rereading and many of these techniques have no benefits. It's just that there are better revision techniques out there which are far more beneficial and can give you high marks in the same amount of time. As for rereading, you soon begin to hit a point where you see no progress being made. Take this study from 1968 as an example, where university students were asked to read a 1,500 word text about the making of leather or a 750 word text about Australian history, 0, 1, 2 or 4 times. Each rereading was done immediately after the previous rereading, and after a 10-minute delay they were asked to take a test where they had to fill in the gaps. As expected, students who did not read the text at all did the worst at around 17% correct. Those who read it once did better at 32% correct, and those who read it twice did even better at 43%. But then those who read it 4 times did only slightly better at 45% correct. Now, what does this mean for us? It means that whilst rereading can be effective, doing it over and over again in a short time period, like just before an exam, we soon begin to hit a point at which rereading does little to improve our score. Yet, the irony is that before tests, students who reread over and over are the most confident in their abilities to score a good mark, only to then not do so well. That's because they soon began to hit the limit of the benefits they could derive from rereading, which says 45% of the marks, which obviously depends on the subject, but you get the idea that rereading more times won't necessarily help you to push that score even higher. You'll soon begin to hit a limit. Rereading also gives us the illusion that we know and understand the material, but the reality is that we still have trouble recalling the material. It's far too easy to mistake rereading for being effective because we recognize the words and the material that we learnt in class, but there's an important distinction between recognizing something and then being able to recall it in an exam. Now, the conclusion that the researchers came to after reading dozens of studies on rereading is that finally, although rereading is relatively economical with respect to time demands and training requirements when compared to some other learning techniques, rereading is typically much less effective. The relative disadvantage of rereading to other techniques is the largest strike against rereading and is the factor that weighed most heavily in our decision to assign it a low utility, which basically means that rereading is okay when you're short on time and no one has to really teach you how to do it, but rereading is far inferior to other learning techniques, and ultimately the researchers gave it a low utility rating in the research review. Now, just like rereading, cramming is another go-to strategy which isn't as effective as other techniques, which we will learn about later in the series. I'm not going into as much detail of the evidence of why cramming doesn't work because we all know it doesn't. You probably have experienced it yourself when cramming for an exam. only to get a mediocre score and to forget everything a few days later, because that's happened a few times to me too. Yet, despite cramming not working, we see so many people do it in school and in adult life. Even many teachers, trainers and coaches believe that the most effective way to get good at something is to practice it over and over again until you have it down. But research actually shows the opposite, that spacing out practice from, let's say, 1 day to 7 days goes a long way in both understanding and long-term retention. And it doesn't just go for studying. Sitting down and focusing on any task for an extended period of time, whether it be practicing a sporting technique or a musical instrument or anything else, is nowhere near as good as and effective as spacing out that practice over a longer interval. Ultimately, while cramming is better than not studying at all, it mostly just gives us a warm feeling that we've mastered the material because we've been looping for it over and over again in our short-term memory. What we gain from cramming is very temporary, and our sense of understanding is only an illusion. As we will soon see, it's only through long-term effortful learning techniques such as active recall and spaced repetition that allows us to process, understand and reconsolidate information in the best manner. Next up is highlighting, which is another commonly used technique. Now, while it is useful in, say, an English exam when you have to pick out interesting points in a text, which you then have to analyze and write about, research has shown it's ineffective as a learning technique. For instance, take this study from 1994 in which university students read through around 8,000 words of articles. They were split up into 1 of 3 groups, a control, one which only reads the article, and another which is free to highlight as much as they want to. The students were given an hour to study the text and were told to return to the lab a week later. The students were then given 10 minutes to review their text with the highlighting on for the highlighting group, and were then given a 54-item multiple choice test. The researchers found that the students who used highlighting did no better than the other groups. And it isn't just this study, many other studies have shown the same thing. Now, that doesn't mean to say highlighting has no benefits. In another study, they found that students who were asked questions relevant to what they highlighted performed better on those questions than students who did not highlight at all. But they also lost a few marks on questions on the information they didn't highlight. Ultimately, the common problem that we face is that we tend to over-highlight, and this reduces how much the highlighted information stands out from the rest of the information. Because in an extreme case, if you end up highlighting everything, then you may as well have highlighted nothing. Once again, the researchers said that highlighting was of low utility, and for most students, highlighting does very little to improve their exam performance. Now, next up is summarization. This is something commonly used by students in which they read through a page of a textbook, then summarize what they learned on a separate piece of paper. But let's look at what the evidence says about this. So in 1978, a study was done in which secondary school students were assigned into groups and were given 30 minutes to study a text. Students in the summarization group were told to write 3 lines that summarized the main points from the text. There was another note-taking group which could write 3 lines for each page of the text rather than for the whole text. And the final group was a control group who just read the text without doing anything else. Students were then tested straight away or a week later on 25 questions. It was found that students in the summarization group on average did not do significantly better than those who were told to just take notes. Ultimately, those conducting the research review placed summarization in the middle when compared to other learning techniques in the study, but said it was still less powerful than other techniques such as active recall and spaced repetition. They rated summarization to be of low utility and said that whilst it's an effective strategy for those who are skilled at summarizing, most students would require a lot of training in showing them how to summarize effectively, which makes the strategy less doable for most students. Now, you may have also heard about the popular idea that you fit into one of several types of learners, whether it be visual, auditory, read-write, or kinesthetic learners, and that if you can find information presented in a way that matches your preferred learning style, then you will be more successful. But whether we like it or not, this is an idea that is not supported by any empirical evidence. For example, in a 2008 study, the researchers performed a research review of the existing papers on learning styles and found very little credible evidence from well-designed experiments about the existence of learning styles. They argue that given the lack of evidence for learning styles, any use of tests or tools designed for one particular learning style are just a waste of time and resources. Research shows that when the learning style matches the nature of the content, whether it be geometry as visual or poetry as verbal, then students perform better regardless of what they believe their preferred learning style to be. Now, this makes sense if you think about it. If you were learning about geometry, then obviously you would want a visual approach. You wouldn't want someone to explain geometry in audio form to you because you're a so-called auditory learner. Anyways, that's it for this video, and I'll see you in the next video in the series.